All right, hello, I am Liz Ryan, the Adult Programming Coordinator at the Derry Public Library. I'd like to welcome everyone and welcome Russ to the Wild Edibles program. A few other programming notes. This Saturday at 3 p.m. we are going to be doing a program on the history of the New Hampshire primary. And in November we have a number of programs, one on the history of Sherlock Holmes. We have one that I am hosting on film censorship. And we also have a presentation on American animation and the top 100 cartoon characters of all time. Of course, that program will be condensed as I don't think we can do all 100 characters in just an hour. And without further ado, I will let Russ start the presentation.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. And I am sorry that we can't get together in person for me to share these slides with you, because one of the things I do in my actual in-person programs is I make yummy things from wild edibles to share with the audience. So you will see photos of them tonight, and I apologize in advance for not being able to deliver them to you through the internet. But when things get better, and they will eventually, I look forward to being able to do that again. So in the meantime, though, what you're going to look at is basically the PowerPoint presentation that I would have presented had we met in person in April. So before I get to individual slides, I just want to fill you in on one basic topic, which is conservation. I encourage folks to be good conservationists when they're out picking things from the wild, especially when native species are involved, because native plants often have important roles in the ecosystem. Animals rely upon them for food or some other important portion of their life cycle. So I encourage people to use some forbearance and restraint when gathering native plants from the wild, just to make sure that you don't upset the ecological balance in any way. But depending upon the part of the plant you're picking, there are going to be different impacts. For example, berry picking and nut gathering, those are relatively benign foraging activities because all you're doing is picking the seed dispersal portion of the organism. So there's usually a lot of those around. If you gather some, it's not that big deal at all. But if you are digging plants up to harvest them, if you're stripping all the flowers off the leaves off plants to harvest them, you can imagine that could be more traumatic on the plants. So do keep that in mind. All right, but that's for the native species. Then we also have lots of edible non-native plants, including weeds and invasive species. And those are much more guilt-free foraging opportunities because they usually don't have important roles in the ecosystem. Usually they're so ubiquitous and numerous that you can just gather them with a clear conscience. And I will, in the talk about whether things are native, non-native, common, not common, invasive, whatever, so that you'll know from the slideshow. And the last topic I should cover in general before we get into individual slides is, where do you go pick stuff? Well, I know more precise information about this in Massachusetts than where I'm from than I do in New Hampshire, but I'll give you a couple basic bits of advice. First of all, I avoid gathering from any really fussed over manicured landscapes. So closely cropped lawns, golf courses, places where it's likely that they're using chemicals to subdue the stuff they don't like. So I try to avoid my exposure to that if I can. I avoid gathering along heavily traveled roadways, places where everybody takes their dog for a walk, although if something is growing above a certain height, even a Great Dane can't reach it. I don't worry too much about that. There's no magic formula about this. It's basically common sense. So, for example, if you're hiking in the woods and you see a nice patch of berries and there's a big pile of building debris dumped next to the berry patch, probably not a good idea to pick those berries. If the plants themselves don't look healthy, they're wilted, spotted, stunted, there's just something off about them, it's possible that they are picking up some contaminants in the soil that you wouldn't expose yourself to, or perhaps they were sprayed with herbicide, and that can happen sometimes with some of the invasive species in my show. People try to control them with herbicides. So the good news about that is that unless you come upon that patch of plants less than 15 minutes after the plants were sprayed, you will know the plants were sprayed because they start to look awful right away. So I don't worry too much about accidentally picking plants that were sprayed with herbicide. All right, so where do you go pick stuff? So I look for the shaggier, more out of the way places away from people and dogs and stuff like that. Um, and I'll give you one specific place. It's in Massachusetts where I know ahead of time that you can go foraging. It's actually not that far from Derry. And then I'll give you a piece of generic advice, and then we'll get on to specific plants. So the specific suggestion I have for you is to go to Essex County, Massachusetts. So this is Northeast Mass. This is the closest part of Mass to Derry. So once you're on I-93 and you cross into Massachusetts, you are in Essex County. Because there was a land trust there, the Essex County Greenbelt Association happens to be the organization that published my foraging book. And they allow foraging as a permitted activity on all their properties that are open to the public, which is dozens of properties covering many hundreds of acres. And so you could just go to their website, ecga.org, and then pull up a property map and a trail map and just go there and start nibbling. It's that simple. Although they certainly would encourage conservation-minded foraging the way that I described earlier. And here's my generic piece of advice, and that is to go foraging at organic farms. And I don't mean in any way to deter you from patronizing the organic farm stand, getting a CSA share if that'll work for you, because as many yummy weeds and invasive species there are out there, there aren't enough to make a significant dent in our food supply. So we really need to grow our food. And organic is a great way to do it. But in addition, organic farms provide great foraging opportunities. So why is that? Well, the reason number one is the obvious one is they're not slathering everything with chemicals. Reason number two is the way they manage weeds at organic farms is they do it strategically. They're not weeding every square inch of the farm every single day. They weed where they need to. And then where they don't, they just let the field go, especially this time of year, where most of the crops are done and the fields are basically just left alone until they might be plowed under or replanted following spring. So if you time your visit to an organic farm, you can find huge amount of weeds, enough to feed whole armies. And so although none of us are having huge dinner parties right now, when we can do that, again, organic farm is a great place, you know, if you're working wild ingredients into your menu to gather all the raw material you need. Then the third reason is the living soil, the organic soil that makes the organically grown fruits and vegetables so healthy to eat. All the good stuff is getting into the weeds too. So the weeds you harvest at organic farms are going to be particularly large and luscious and yummy and nutritious, much more, let's say, than a weed growing in a crack in the sidewalk. And then the last reason is the edges of organic farms often have good edge habitats where there's fruit trees, nut trees, berry bushes, stuff like that. So my advice is form a symbiotic relationship with your local organic farmer because they have the weeds, you want the weeds, so potentially it's this great partnership. So I don't suggest that you just go to organic farm and start picking. You need to talk to a staff person there, worker there first, just to make sure they're comfortable with it. They usually are. In fact, I often get invited to do wild edibles in-person walks at organic farms. So I think they understand the synergy there. And the last bit of generic advice I'll give you is, it is really good if you can find a landowner or a land manager from any place that you want to pick and just ask them, is it okay if I gather these? And I rarely get turned down. And the nice thing about getting oh, sure, go ahead, is then you can, you know, forage in a really joyful way. You don't have to be peeking over your shoulder to make sure that nobody's going to get on your case for what you're doing. All right, so with that, let's plunge into the show. And let me just tell you ahead of time that these plants are organized chronologically by foraging opportunities. So I'm starting in the spring. So the first plants I'm going to cover, the foraging opportunities for them won't be available until the spring. And then we'll get into the summer, we'll get into the fall. And near the end of the show, we'll get into stuff that you can still forage for right now. All right, here we go. Okay, so if this were a live program, I'd be asking you in the audience, what is this plant? And I'm sure a lot of you would chime in and say fiddleheads. Yes. However, that in and of itself is not enough to know if it's a safe fiddlehead to eat. And a mistake that a lot of novice foragers make is they go out in the spring, they see the ferns at the curled up fiddlehead stage like this, and they say to themselves, oh, fiddleheads, boy, that looks an awful lot what I've seen for sale in the stores. It must be the same thing. And so they pick it and they bring it home and they cook it up and it tastes horrible. And they say, oh, where did we go wrong? Where they went wrong is they harvested the wrong species of fern. I only know of 2 species of fern that taste good and only one that's safe to eat in quantity, and that is this one. This is the ostrich fern. This is, in fact, the fiddlehead fern that you see for sale in the stores and restaurant menus occasionally and stuff like that. So I'm going to point out to you the 5 ways to distinguish the ostrich fern from the other species of fern. So first of all, you want to look for the right habitat. So this is where you typically find ostrich ferns in the wild, is in alluvial floodplain soil, like along our major rivers, like the Merrimack River or the tributaries to the Merrimack. That's where you're most likely to find the ostrich fern natural patches growing. Second thing is on the actual clump of ferns itself, you see, and it grows in a vase-shaped clump. And then you'll see that the stem has got a groove running down the center of it. And if you cut the stem in cross section, it forms a U. It's very similar to a celery stalk. And then these papery scales that you often encounter that wrap around the curled up part, which is called a crozier, these flake off really easily with your fingers. So it's not like a wool, like a cinnamon fern. And then the last thing to look for are these guys. These are the fertile fronds, the spore-bearing fronds. And not every clump of fiddleheads is going to have these, but you'll usually find them in the patch. And if you cut their stems in cross sections, you also see that U shape. So if you're seeing all 5 of these things present in the patch that you're interested in identifying, that is for sure the ostrich fern. Okay, so this is a good opportunity to talk to you about conservation, because this is one that sometimes by people that are unscrupulous and pick too many, probably because they're selling them to some restaurant or produce store, pick more than they should for sustainability reasons. So I recommend picking 1 or 2 of the fiddleheads per clump. That's it. Let the rest grow out. That's a totally sustainable way of harvesting the species. Unfortunately, what some people will do is they'll go pick every single one, and that saps a lot of strength from the plant. You could actually kill the plant by harvesting it so hard. So 1 or 2 per clump. That's a sustainable way of interacting with this plant in the wild. All right, so if you've ever bought fiddleheads at the store and cooked them up and been not very impressed with them, you might keep this in mind, kind of that analogy to sweet corn, is you want to minimize the amount of time from getting the fiddleheads and eating them. And this was demonstrated very amply by this woman, Beth Basler, who's a naturalist out in Western Mass. And she took a bunch of us to a patch of fiddleheads growing next to the Connecticut River. And she brought her camp stove with her to the fiddlehead patch. And we were eating those fiddleheads 10 minutes after we picked them. And they were truly exquisite that way. All right, here's Marsh Marigold. So this isn't a plant that is eaten that much these days, but it was an important plant that rural people relied on, like ostrich fern fiddleheads, back in like the days before World War II, when it was hard for people to get leafy green vegetables in the spring. Nowadays, we're spoiled. We're used to going to the supermarket and getting anything we want any day of the year we want. Well, back then, people were living off plants in the root cellar and stuff they had put up and things like that. And so when things greened up in the spring, they're very eager to start eating green things. And often it was the perennial herbaceous wild species that offered the foraging opportunities before the gardens had done anything. So that's where the Marsh Marigold goes in. So a couple things about this one. First of all, it is a wonderful native wildflower. You wouldn't want to harm this plant in any way. So I'm picking 1 or 2 leaves per plant. That's it. But I have seen patches of this plant where there are hundreds of plants. And even if you're just picking 1 or 2 leaves per plant, you'll get enough to make a nice side dish. And another thing is you want to harvest these leaves before the flowers bloom, and you absolutely need to cook them, just like you need to cook the ostrich fern fiddleheads too. With these, I even recommend boiling them for a few minutes, pouring off the water, and then boiling them again for a few minutes more, just to make sure that all the toxin is dispelled in the boiling water. And then the leaves have a lot of substance to them, so they won't get all soft and mushy on you by boiling. And the flavor is a lot like spinach. And so you might say, well, I'll just go to the store and buy spinach, which is perfectly fine. I just like to teach Marsh Marigold because it was a historically important wild food to country people in New Hampshire going back 80 or more years ago. And yes, you can grow Marsh Marigold from seed. You can gather the seed in June and then sow it right away, or store it in a plastic bag and sow it later. And that's a fun one that I'm growing in my nursery. Yeah, and so there's a picture of Marsh Marigold I grew from seed in a solar room in the early spring. All right, so here is this plant comes in a native and non-native version, and it's really hard to tell apart, but you don't need to, because the way you're harvesting it, you're not harming the plant at all. So if this was a live program, I'd be asking you what it is, and some people know it is stinging nettle. And stinging nettle is a wonderfully edible plant. The tricky part is harvesting it and preparing it, but once it's cooked, it's really yummy and very nutritious for you. So what I will do is just gather the top cluster of leaves at the top of these little stalks, and this is what the plants look like when I'm harvesting them. So this is in the spring, like the second week of April is when the plant's at this stage. And where you're most likely to find stinging nettles is either along rivers or in areas where there were or are livestock. Those are places where I tend to see them. And so you fill your bag full of nettles and bring it home. And then you use some tongs to fling them into the cooking pot. You don't want to touch them. And you basically steaming the nettle greens and the water that's still clinging to the leaves from washing them. So it will cook down like that. And then it takes about 5 minutes. And then this steaming process completely disarms the plant, and it converts what caused a sting and a raw vegetable into a protein. And so stinging nettles are very high, well, relatively high in protein for a leafy green vegetable, plus they have all kinds of other minerals and vitamins in them. It's got calcium in it. So it's the closest thing I know of to a vitamin pill in the plant world. It's really good for you. So after you've steamed the nettle greens, you can eat them just plain. The flavor's kind of like split peas. You can incorporate them into different dishes. So here's cream of stinging nettle soup. This recipe is in my book, and that's quite yummy. And then stinging nettle balls is just using the retro recipe, the spinach balls recipe from the 1950s. We're using Pepperidge Farm stuffing mix to hold it all together. You substitute the steamed nettle greens for the spinach, and the recipe works great. All right, this plant looks a lot like stinging nettle, but it's actually not related at all. This is a mint, and some of you might have known that when you see the square-sided stem with the opposite leaves. That's the characteristic morphology of plants in the mint family. This is catnip, and catnip does grow wild in New England and has the opposite effect on people as it has on cats. It's a sedative, it's a tranquilizer, so people will drink catnip tea to relax after a stressful day, and you can use the leaves fresh or dried, either way. So there's a plant called curled or curly dock, and this is the antidote to the stinging nettle. So if you get stung by stinging nettle, you just scrunch up a dock leaf and rub it on the place you got stung, and it helps make the sting go away. This plant's edible too. I look for the leaves like this, the unrolling leaves in the spring, and you need to blanch them because they have a tinge of bitterness to them. So I drop them into boiling water for just 20 seconds. And then you use them as a cooked vegetable, like a substitute for spinach. So the cooked dock leaves are really good in spanakopita, the Greek spinach pie with the phyllo dough and the feta cheese. You just use the blanched dock leaves instead of spinach, and it comes out great. And the root is medicinal. It's a big yellow taproot, and it has several medicinal values. The one that I'm most familiar with is it helps the body assimilate iron better. So pregnant women, anemic people will take it for that purpose, to boost their iron levels. Okay, so this species is at or near the top of the ecological blacklist. The ecologists really hate it. This is a species called Japanese knotweed. And right now, it's in the process of dying back for the season. So these leaves that look like this have turned yellow. They might have even fallen off by now. And this plant's about 8 feet tall, grows in these big monoculture clusters, clump usually like 25 feet or more in diameter, to the exclusion of pretty much everything else. So the ecologists definitely don't like this plant, but it is wonderfully edible. And so let me tell you about that. So in the spring, so this is mid to late April, early May, I would say first 2 weeks of May in Derry, you want to look for all these dried reddish brown bamboo-like stalks from last year's knotweed. And then you look for the sprouts coming up amidst the patch of all those dried stalks from last year. So over here on the left side of the photo, this shoot is a foot tall, and that's what I call the wild asparagus stage. So you can just gather the shoots at this stage and just steam it for a few minutes and eat it hot or cold like asparagus. My favorite stage to harvest the knotweed is what I call the wild rhubarb stage, where I let the stalks get a little bit taller, like 1.5 to 2 feet tall, and I cut them at ground level, and then I very carefully peel the skin off the stalks because the skin is stringy. There's nothing poisonous about it, but if you don't peel the skin off the stalks, it'll get caught in your teeth. So peel that off, but the knotweeds are hollow, so you don't want to peel the stalk too deeply or all you have left is the hole. You just want to take that very outer layer off, and then it will look like this. And this crisp green inner part of the plant you can eat right on the spot if you want. It's tart and juicy, kind of like a Granny Smith apple. Or you can chop it up like I've done in this bowl here and use these chopped up knotweed pieces instead of rhubarb in virtually any recipe calling for rhubarb. So, for example, here is my strawberry knotweed pie. The recipe is in my book. And virtually everybody I serve this pie to say, this is even better than strawberry rhubarb pie. And there's the shoot. It's an example of the shoot that I use, so I peel this, chop it up, and that's what goes in there instead of rhubarb. And there's plenty of other yummy things you can do with knotweed too. Anyway, you'd use rhubarb, so you can make stewed knotweed, knotweed crumb cake. There's a go anywhere knotweed squares that I make that has a shortbread crust and sort of a knotweed custardy type top. It's good all those ways. Okay, but maybe you're looking at this pie and you say, all right, well, Russ says it's good, but I'm a little intimidated by this pie crust and this lattice work top. I don't know if I can pull this off. So I'm going to show you a way to use the knotweed that requires no cooking skill whatsoever. Is you could just take those little peeled stem pieces that are hollow and fill them with like a salmon mousse or strawberry flavored cream cheese. And then you have these tart little edible containers that are delicious just like that. And you don't need to know how to cook to do that. All right, so here's another invasive species called garlic mustard. And it is edible at this stage, but my favorite stage to eat it is a little bit earlier in the season. So this would be like the first week of May in Derry, is I would just be harvesting these tender stalks in the plant when they're nice and soft and supple, so not after they get stiff, when they're very bendable. I find these to be relatively mild. You can eat them raw and you can chop them up and use them in a stir fry. So here is winter cress. This is a very common farm weed. And at this stage, the best part to harvest on the plant are these guys, the broccoli florets. And you need to boil them because this plant's a little pungent, but after you boil them for several minutes, the flavor is identical to broccoli raw. All right, if this was a live group, I'd be asking you, what is this plant? And some people in the audience would say, oh, that's phlox. Well, it's not phlox. There's a very easy way to tell this plant apart from phlox. All phlox flowers have 5 petals. These flowers have 4 petals. This is, in fact, a cousin of garlic mustard and wintercress. There's a plant called Dame's rocket. It's also in the mustard family. And you see how it comes in a white color and a purpley color? That's invariably how you see the plant in the wild, the 2 colors together. So it's an easy species to identify at a distance. And although there's other parts of this plant that are edible, I just like to eat the flowers in this because it's fun to eat flowers. And these are relatively showy flowers. They're almost 1 inch across. And although the flowers, the white flowers and the purpley flowers have the same flavor, I tend to just use the purpley flowers because it's a funner color than white. And so these are great in a salad to decorate a side dish. And I don't know what the official status of this plant is in New Hampshire. It's definitely a non-native species. In Massachusetts, it's considered an invasive species. So it's a complete guilt-free foraging opportunity. You cannot pick too much Dame's rocket. All right, so this photo is in New Hampshire, but not in southern New Hampshire. That's Mount Washington in the background. This is the view that you get driving north on Route 16 after you've just run the gauntlet of all the outlet stores in North Conway. And then in the spring, you'll see the presidential range with snow still on the mountains. But the purpose of this photo is to talk to you about dandelions. Dandelions are probably more responsible for turning more people off of eating wild plants than anything else. And the story usually goes something like this. It's the spring and you look out in your backyard and you see all these dandelions blooming and you say to yourself, I heard dandelions are edible. I should try them. So you go out to your yard, pick a few leaves, bring them indoors, put a little oil and vinegar on them. You take one bite. It's incredibly bitter. You spit it out. You say, yuck, I'm never going to eat a wild plant again, which is a real shame because dandelions are great if you eat the right part at the right time. So what is that and when is that? Well, my opinion, when you start to see whole fields turning yellow with dandelion flowers, it's really too late to be eating dandelions. I like to harvest them before the flowers show up. In fact, it's the unopened flower buds, which I consider to be the tastiest part of a dandelion. In fact, I consider dandelion buds to be among my favorite vegetables, period, cultivated or wild. They taste like a cross between corn, spinach, Brussels sprouts, and artichokes. And so you pick them off the plants, you boil them for just 60 seconds. That's it. That's all the cooking they need. And then you can incorporate them into soups or omelets or casseroles. But before you do anything with them, before you put any butter or oil on them, just taste them. And I think you'd be amazed at how good they are. And if you want to gather dandelion leaves, I gather them at the same time. So when I'm picking the buds off the plants, if I see some nice tender leaves, I just harvest them too, prepare them the same way. So violets are edible. So violet flowers usually come out just after the dandelions, and violet flowers are edible. You can candy them and then use them as decoration for like this black walnut cake, or the flowers are good just like that, put into salads is fine. And violet leaves are edible until the flowers go away, and then the leaves start to get too tough and too bitter. But violet leaves are edible raw or cooked, and they're high in vitamins A and C. All right, chicory, this flower is out of sequence because this is a midsummer bloomer, but this is what chicory plants look like when they're blooming. They're very closely related to dandelions. And chicory leaves are edible this time of year, including in the spring. And that's true for curl dock too. I should have mentioned that if you can find curl dock this time of year and stinging nettle this time of year, they're all edible in the fall too. So the main edible part on chicory is the root, and you make a coffee substitute from it. This is all explained in my book, but basically you just roast the roots, grind them up, and brew beverage from them, and it really does taste like coffee. The one big difference is there's no caffeine in the chicory drink. So if you say to yourself, what's the point in drinking it if there's no caffeine in it, then the chicory's just not going to cut it for you. Chickweed is edible in the spring or the fall, this time of year, when it's nice and tender. I use it as a sprout substitute in a sandwich or a lettuce substitute in a salad. Daisies are edible. The main edible part are the leaves before the flowers come out. So you need to be able to recognize the plant then. This is what it looks like then. And I apologize, this photo is a little out of focus, but if you look at the flower buds, they have a flat top to them, and they have these markings on them, which looks kind of like the spokes of a bicycle wheel. So look for that, and then look for leaves like this attached to those plants. And I think daisy leaves can be so yummy. I have never cooked with them. I just put them right into salads the way they are. Lamb's quarters, the main time to gather this is in May or early June, but you may still be able to find plants like this now because this is a really common weed in farms, and the plant is very opportunistic. So it tries to grow anytime the ground is disturbed and the seeds germinate. And this white dust in the center, that's not from a road or anything, that's a natural mealy dust the plant produces on its own. It's one of the ways to help identify the species. And you can use this just like spinach. You can eat it raw, you can eat it cooked, you can steam it, you don't have to boil it. It's also really good in spanakopita, the Greek spinach pie. All right, sheep's sorrel, very common weed in dairy where your soil, like down here in Massachusetts and Eastern Mass, is a little bit more on the acidic side. So this is a diminutive cousin of the French garden sorrel, so you can use it the same way. You can make a sorrel sauce from it, a sorrel soup from it, and so on. And here's a completely unrelated plant, which is still available now, called wood sorrel. This one has a really long season availability. You can find it at this stage in the spring, all the way through the summer, into the fall, and probably will still be available until the ground is frozen. So any tender part of this plant is edible. So the leaves are edible, the flowers are edible. These guys right here, the unripe seed pods, they're juicy and tart too. So the whole plant is tart. And the chemical responsible for the tart flavor in this plant and the sheep sorrel is a chemical called oxalic acid, which is not good to eat in humongous amounts. Like if you ate a giant salad bowl full of just this plant, it could inhibit your body's ability to uptake calcium. It could irritate your stomach lining, but there's no reason to be unduly concerned about the chemical because it's present in a lot of conventional vegetables like beets and spinach and rhubarb. So as long as you're eating it in moderation, it's perfectly fine. All right, wild lettuce is edible. The plants are at this stage in late May, early June, And this is a plant I'm propagating in my edible native plant nursery. And here's my mom who occasionally helps me out in my nursery. So this is what the plants look like after they germinate. And then the plants winter over. And then the second year, because this is a biennial, it's a 2-year life cycle, it bolts like lettuces tend to do, produces the flowers and the seeds. So, but this one with a skinny terminal lobe like that, I find this to be relatively mild and yummy even after it begins to bolt. All right, so when I make stuff from wild ingredients, I'm not a purist about it. I don't insist that every single ingredient that I make in a dish has to be wild. So for example, for my strawberry knotweed pie, I'm not using yak butter for the shortening. I can use regular butter, regular sugar, regular flour, and the knotweed makes it a wild dish. Okay, so, but you can make a salad completely from wild ingredients, which is what I did here. But I don't mean to deter you from just throwing a few violet flowers into regular salad, that's fine. But if you wanted to, you could go extreme and make a salad completely from wild ingredients like I have here. So let me tell you what's in the salad. So these little yellow flowers are mustard flowers, the purpley flowers are chicory flowers. There's chickweed and lamb's quarters and plants like that bulking up the salad. And then the little red berries are partridge berries, and then the orangey berries are ground cherries. So this is what partridge berries looks like. These are pretty common in and around dairy. These have virtually no flavor. So why use them? Because they're pretty. So I'll put a few on top of the salad just to add that nice color in there. And then the ground cherries, and this one is still available now. So this is a late summer, fall thing to look for. So once we get a really, really hard freeze, that might be the end of this plant, but you still should be able to find it. Look for it on the edge of cultivated areas, especially where there's like horse paddocks or other animal activity. And the key thing for the ground cherry that distinguishes it from its poisonous lookalike, which is called horse nettle, is that you cannot see these fruit unless you peel this outer husk off. This is called a calyx. So if you're just looking at a plant and you're seeing yellow tomato-like fruits, that's not the edible ground cherry. It's probably the poisonous horse nettle. So yeah, so this plant's called ground cherry because the place to look for the fruit is not still attached to the plant, because when the fruit is ripened, so when this husk, which is called a calyx, when these are ripe, this calyx color turns a kind of a tan color, and it falls off the plant with the ripe fruit still inside the little package, the little husk. So that's what to look for when you harvest this plant. And I hope you're still able to find some. All right, this is a plant that's also a biennial with a 2-year life cycle. This is what it looks like at the end of the first year, the beginning of the second year. And that's the stage when you want to harvest the root. There's a plant that you probably all heard of called evening primrose. It's just a hard plant to recognize without the flower on there. The flowers are edible, by the way, but the main part that's edible is the root. And this time of year, you can gather evening primrose roots and eat them. So, so far my favorite, and also all the way through the winter into the following spring when you'll see rosettes like this. So eventually these plants get 2 or 3 feet or more tall, and the roots aren't edible then. But in the intervening period between the first and second growing seasons, that's when the roots are edible. And you see how it's a taproot with this pinkish coloration near the top, which is a key distinguishing feature. Now, so far, my favorite way to use evening primrose is to make pancakes with them, like potato pancakes. So you can get out whatever potato pancake recipe you use, and you can grate up an equivalent amount of the evening primrose root and substitute it for the potatoes. It should come out great. All right. Okay, so this plant is at this stage right now. These nasty birds, you get caught in your socks, your dog's fur in the fall. And by the way, the guy who invented Velcro did get the idea from these birds. It is a plant, aptly enough, called burdock. It's a wonderfully edible plant, not the burrs, but lots of other parts are edible. I'm going to talk about 2 in particular. So the edible root, it's the same deal as the evening primrose is a biennial plant, 2-year life cycle. So you want to harvest the root at the end of the first year, the beginning of the second year. Unfortunately, you can't grab the burdock foliage and yank on it and get a root out that way. It will break on you, so you have to dig them up, which is a lot of work, and I don't usually bother. So, and if you do dig up the root, I pretty much guarantee that your patience will give out before the root does, because it's very long. And so you might dig up a root, you might have like a 1.5 foot long piece of root. And at this stage, an easy way to cook it is just wash it off. You don't have to peel it, slice it into 1/2 inch thick rounds and then boil it in salted water till it's tender, about 15 minutes. It will taste like a starchy artichoke. But I'm too lazy to do that. Instead, I wait until the second year's growth and I harvest this part here, the developing cylindrical central flower stalk. And I harvest it like the first or second week of June, and I cut it off at ground level, lop off the top cluster leaves, and that just takes a few seconds. So you see here in the left part of the photo, so I gathered all these burdock flower stalks in about 20 minutes. So you do have to peel them because the outer part is stringy and bitter, so you have to trim that off. But unlike the knotweed, the burdock stalks are solid all the way through. So even after you take the outer part off, there's a lot of food value left over. And so at this stage, you just chop up the peeled burdock stalks and boil them in salted water till they're tender, which is about 5 minutes. And then it's a delicious vegetable just plain, or it's really good thrown in spaghetti sauce, or it's really good in the recipe where ordinarily you would take artichoke hearts and mayonnaise and Parmesan cheese and breadcrumbs and mix it all together and bake it in the oven. And it's a spread that you put on crackers. You can substitute the boiled burdock flower stalk rounds for the artichoke hearts in that recipe. It works great. And that recipe is on my webpage. So at the end of this talk, I'll show you the URL where you can connect to my webpage, and then you can pull up the recipe page and find that in other recipes as well. Yeah, so there's that burdock bloomstalk bake that I just mentioned. All right, so here's a plant that you run into when you're bushwhacking the woods, and it is a figurative and literal pain to run into it. It's called cat briar, and the edible parts in these plants in the spring is the tender growing tip of the woody stem. It has a tart flavor. You can pop it right in your mouth. But this is a cousin that I like even more. So this is an herbaceous thornless cousin called carrion flower. And when you harvest it, it looks like asparagus. And see in this photo right here, and you cook it like asparagus. It tastes like asparagus. It's related to asparagus. So that's all great. So why is it called carrion flower? So here we are out camping. I'm using a Frisbee as a plate here. And you notice these little spherical balls right here. So those are the immature flower buds. And when this plant blooms, and that's what it looks like when it blooms, then you discover why this plant is called carrion flower. Because if you hold your nose up to that spherical blossom, you will probably recoil in disgust because it smells just like rotting meat or dirty gym socks. So, so when you encounter carrion flower when it's blooming, it's kind of an unpleasant experience. But if you harvest it before it blooms, it's quite yummy. So here's black locust. This grows all over southern New Hampshire. This should be a very easy plant to find when it's blooming, which is around Memorial Day weekend is when to look for it. And the one edible part on black locust are the flowers, and you can eat them raw, straight off the plant. They taste like sweet pea pods. They smell like jasmine. You can also make stuff with them, pull them off their central stalks first, and you can make these black locust flower fritters. This recipe is in my book. So pokeweed's edible at only one stage, at the shoot stage, when the shoots look like this. And even at this stage, you have to boil them for 7 minutes to make them safe to eat. So remember that. And then the rest of the plant, so the mature plants, which have the red berries on them if the birds haven't cleaned them off yet, that's this species right here. These berries are not edible by people, especially not the seeds. And the mature foliage is poisonous. The root's poisonous. The shoots are edible if you boil them for 7 minutes. And here's the favor the plant does to help you find what shoots are pokeweed shoots. So, so here you go. You might say to yourself, all right, so that's a pokeweed shoot, but how do I know? There's got to be other things that look like that. And there are a few things that sort of look like that. So here's the favor the pokeweed does. After the growing season, the mature stalk doesn't completely disintegrate. It will persist as a skeleton, and it will remain there through the following spring. So when the shoots are coming up, the next year's growth, you can see last year's dried stalk going in the same ground where this year's growth is happening. And then you'll know for sure that it's pokeweed plant. All right, milkweed's edible. There's a whole chapter on milkweed in my book. I forgot to say there's a whole chapter on pokeweed in my book. And milkweed has at least 4 edible stages to it, and they happen chronologically in succession. So that's why I call it a procrastinating forager's dream food, because if you mess up and miss a stage, you just wait a while till the next edible stage develops. So the milkweed buds are edible, and there they are. So I use the same cooking method for milkweed as I do for pokeweed, as I boil it for 7 minutes. And look how well these milkweed buds held up. These have been cooked for 7 minutes. If anything, they look nicer than they did on the plant. So you could eat these just as a side dish if you wanted to. But a really good way to use them is in this recipe, milkweed egg puff, which is in my book. And the pods are edible when they're up to 1 inch long and nice and firm to the touch. You boil them for 7 minutes, and the texture and the flavor is really similar to green beans. Okay, though, but here is a monarch butterfly caterpillar to remind us that this is a really important plant for them. So it's really important that we make sure there's lots of milkweed plants out in the environment that are harvesting. The milkweed parts do not in any way reduce the availability of these plants for the monarch butterfly caterpillars. So this is a plant I actively propagate from seed. I share seed with people. I've got it growing next to my driveway at my house, and the monarch butterflies have found it there, and I find crystals attached to my garage door, and that's all good. So that's my way of giving back in gratitude to the milkweed plants and the monarchs for the opportunity to share this tasty species with them. All right, here's sassafras, and this one you'll tend to run into the further south you go, so it's a little bit more common in Massachusetts than it is in New Hampshire, but it does grow in New Hampshire. And this plant is exceedingly easy to recognize because it's got leaves with 3 different shapes: no thumbs, 1 thumb, and 2 thumbs, all in the same plant. It's the only plant that does that. And one edible part is the root, and the root has the root beer flavor. It's on the root bark. And in my book, I've got a recipe for sassafras candy, which is like the root beer barrels used to buy at the penny candy store, only even better because there's little bits of root bark embedded in the candy. So it's quite strongly flavored. Now, I should warn you, though, that the Food and Drug Administration considers saffrole, which is the essential oil that is in the sassafras root bark, to be carcinogenic. And that's so saffrole-containing products are banned from the food supply in the United States. That ban, which is actually a 60-year-old rule, is still in effect. But the study that led to the FDA's decision involved rats, and I and other foragers I know that have done our own research have been unable to find any even anecdotal examples of humans getting cancer from sassafras. So I think it has something to do with, although rats are great laboratory animals, because their digestive systems are different, there isn't 100% overlap between what they can safely eat and what we can eat. And so it's very possible that we can safely metabolize the saffrole into harmless byproducts without a problem. But even so, if you say to yourself, well, if the Food and Drug Administration thinks it's carcinogenic, I'm going to stay away from sassafras root bark, I totally support you in that decision. In fact, I totally support you wherever you want to set your comfort level in anything I'm talking about today. So if you're not sure that you've identified the right species, if you're not sure the place you're gathering it from is a clean space, and you chicken out and don't harvest it and don't eat it, I think that's pretty sensible. So anyway, so that's the root bark, and then the young leaves are used to make fillet powder. So that's what fillet powder is. It's made from dried powdered sassafras leaves, and you can make your own in the spring when the leaves are small. You gather them, dry them, and pulverize them, and then just add the powder to other dishes to flavor them just before you serve them. Cattails are edible. There's a chapter in my book on cattails. I won't be able to cover everything that's edible in this show. I'll just mention a couple things. So the immature flower stalks or the bloom spikes are edible. You just boil them until they're tender and they taste like a cross between corn and artichokes. And the cattail hearts are edible. And it's just the tender part after you peel the outer leaves and the developing stalk, and it tastes like cucumber or hearts of palm. And the cattail pollen is edible and hypoallergenic, and you could just collect this by wandering into the cattail marsh when the plants are blooming and just collect the pollen and then sift it, put it through a fine mesh sieve to get out any beetles or other impurities. And then what goes through you can add to regular flour to make these very nutritious and very pretty looking cattail pollen muffins and crepes and other baked products. All right, so if this were a live group, I'd be saying, what is this plant? And I'd be also informing you that probably most, if not everyone in the audience, has at least heard of this plant and has probably eaten this plant. This is wild rice, and wild rice does grow in New Hampshire. It grows along the Merrimack River. We've got it in Massachusetts, so I suspect that it's up in New Hampshire too. And And this is what it looks like when it's blooming, and then it's ripe in September. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've never harvested my own wild rice because it's a lot of work. You have to pick it, big deal. I pick stuff all the time, but then you have to parch it and winnow it. So I've never gone to all that trouble. I just order my wild rice from the Ojibwe Indian tribe, nativeharvest.com, who gather it in the traditional way with the canoes in the lakes in northern Minnesota. But you could harvest your own wild rice if you wanted to. So here is a plant called sweet flag or calamus, and the edible part is the root, but I like the young shoots on this plant because they're not quite as strong, and they have a gingery flavor. So in the spring, you just peel these outer leaves away, and the inner yellowish leaves have a mild gingery flavor. You can add them to salads. So here is basswood, Tilia americana. There's also Tilia Cordata, which is the little leaf linden. They're edible the exact same way. So the young leaves, when they first come out, you can eat them raw. And then the flowers, when they bloom in June, you make a tea from the flowers, and it has a wonderful lemon honey type flavor. And it also has two medicinal values. It's soothing to your digestive system and to your mental state at the same time. So it's very highly regarded by herbalists for that reason. So here's the Juneberry, perhaps more aptly called July berry in New Hampshire, because this is a plant that blooms in April, but the fruit is ripe at the beginning of the summer. So in Massachusetts, it is ripe on the first day of summer, but in New Hampshire, it might tend to be more like the first week of July that I'd be checking for it. So the time to find the plants is in the spring when they're blooming, and that's where you spot where they are, and then you go check them again in late June, early July, and that's what you want to look for the fruit. So this purple one is ripe. This red one is a day or two short of being ripe. So when they're fully ripe, they're this purpley color. And they look like blueberries, but they really don't taste at all like blueberries. It tastes like a cross between cherries and almonds because they're related to cherries and almonds. They're all related species in the rose family. And so this is a great species for stuffing your face right by the tree, or you can make stuff from the berries. I've got a chapter on Juneberry in my book, and you can make Juneberry muffins with fresh, dried, or frozen Juneberries. And also the dried Juneberries go really good in a wild fruit nut granola, and that recipe's in my book. All right, and although Juneberries do grow in the wild, especially along rivers, which explains the one of the common names shadbush, because the plants bloom when the shad are running upstream in the rivers to spawn. So Juneberries are frequently planted by in public parks and other landscaped areas. And so when I was working in downtown Boston, I used to go to a park, cross the river from my office, and pick quarts of Juneberries that the State Parks Agency had planted in one of the local parks there on my lunch hour. And yeah, you can grow Juneberries from seed. You spit the seeds into your hand, store them in a plastic bag, and then store them in your fridge. And what might happen though is they might start sprouting in the fridge, and when that happens, you have to sow them. And so I've got 2-foot-tall Juneberries I grew from seed I gathered in a public park at my nursery. So mulberries are ripe when Juneberries are ripe, and I like to mix Juneberries and mulberries together to get strudel. A wild strawberry is a delicious wild fruit, as you know, diminutive but yummy. And you can make tea from wild strawberry leaves when the leaves are fresh or thoroughly dried. Apparently when they're wilted, they're slightly toxic, but fresh or thoroughly dried is fine. And the tea that you make from the leaves does taste at least vaguely like the fruit, and it does have vitamin C in it. So if you felt a case of scurvy coming on, you could rush out and make yourself some strawberry leaf tea. All right, so now we're getting into the summer, and jewelweed, which is a plant that's not available now because it definitely first really cold evening that finishes it off for the season. But in the summer, you would look for these plants with orange, sometimes yellow flowers, and then these seed pods that look like this. So they're fully ripe when the angle between the seed pod and the little stem is 90 degrees. If it's greater than that, like this one down here, which is more like 135 degrees, that isn't ripe. This one's ripe, this one's ripe. And the seeds inside the seed pods are the edible part of this plant. The tricky part is when you touch the seed pods, they explode. And so one of the nicknames of this plant is touch me not, because if you rub against the plant when the ripe seed pods are on there, they just start detonating all over the place. So if you want to eat some ripe seeds, what you need to do is sneak up on one of those seed pods and grab it, have it explode in your hand. Don't worry, it won't hurt. Then when you open up your hand, so there's a ripe seed pod right there. So it does all this when it explodes. So the little letter D things that pop out, those are the ripe seeds. And if you eat them, you find they taste just like walnuts, like store-bought English walnuts. Another cool thing you can do with the ripe seeds, which you don't need to do to eat them, but just to see, is if we rub this outer covering off, the inner seed color is this beautiful, bright robin's egg blue color. And I have no idea why the color's in there. It's just one of those unexplained mysteries of Mother Nature. Purslane, this is pretty much gone now because it also doesn't like cold weather. This is a great hot weather weed in an organic farm. You definitely are likely to run into it there, or perhaps even your own vegetable garden. It's edible raw, it's edible cooked. The stems, when they get big like this, you can pickle them. This plant's also very nutritious. It's high in iron and omega-3 fatty acids. And I'm going to show you a way that requires no cooking skill whatsoever to use this plant. Is you can put the purslane leaves in a gazpacho, and you don't even have to make the gazpacho. You can go to Whole Foods and buy the gazpacho, and then just throw the purslane leaves in there, and the texture of the purslane leaves works really well in a gazpacho. Black raspberry is another July summer edible. The fun thing about black raspberry this time of year, though, is the off-season thing the canes do, is they turn this purpley color. So this is a color you can see at quite a distance. So you could be out in February walking your dog, cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, and see these thorny canes way off at the other end of the field. Those are black raspberries. Remember that spot, and then check it in the early summer to look for the right fruit. Black cherries are edible. The fruit's ripe toward the end of the summer, and they vary in flavor quite a lot from tree to tree. Sometimes they're puckery and astringent, other times they can be quite sweet and just about as good as a regular cherry, other than the fact that black cherries are small. There's no getting around that. So black cherry will approach but not quite get to 1/2 inch in diameter, and the pits inside each fruit aren't that much smaller than conventional cherry pits. So I wouldn't recommend trying to utilize black cherries for any recipe that require pitting each individual fruit because they're exceedingly tiresome. So I tend to just stuff my face right by the tree, or you can bring them home and throw them in a pot with some water and simmer them for a while to soften the pulp, and then put it all through a food mill or a sieve. And then the pulp and the juice goes through, and that's the raw material you use for making black cherry jam or jelly or fruit soups or cordials or stuff like that. Black huckleberry is a very common plant in New England. I'm sure a lot of people pick these thinking they're blueberries. There's absolutely no harm in that. These fruits tend to be waterier and seedier than blueberries, but other than that, they're perfectly fine. Bayberries, the main edible part of the bayberry actually aren't the berries themselves, it's the leaves, and you can use bayberry leaves as a substitute for bay leaves in cooking. Sweet fern likes to grow in similar places to bayberry, is they'll grow in nutrient-poor soil because they can make nitrogen fertilizer through symbiotic relationship with the bacteria in the root systems. So this is one of our native species the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era. They would just steep the leaves in hot water for a few minutes. And this is wild bergamot, which I don't actually recommend as a tea. I find this plant has a flavor of oregano, and so that's how I would use it. I would use it like pizza topping, sausage making, soups, omelets, casseroles, stuff like that. And very nice plant for pollinators too. Here's another one of our native species the colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era, spice bush, and they would just steep the twigs in hot water for a few minutes. My favorite edible part to eat on the plant are the berries, the ripe berries. I gather them in September, and then I dry them. And let's just see if I have a photo. Nope, I don't have a photo of the dried berries. Sorry about that. Anyway, when they dry, they get a deep reddish brown, and they turn wrinkly. So they lose this beautiful, bright scarlet color. So, but once they're dry, you can store them in a pantry and just use them for years without them going bad, and just grind up a few in a mortar and pestle for a savory spice. So something like a cross between black pepper and Szechuan peppercorns. And yes, this plant comes in male and female. So if you know of a spice bush plant that never produces any berries, it's probably a male. Another cool thing to look for whenever you're counting spice bush plants is this really neat critter called a spice bush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. and also on sassafras, look for it there. So after the egg hatches, the first young stages of the caterpillar look just like bird poop. So that's an ingenious disguise. And then it morphs into this form where it forms these fake eye patches on its head. The real eyes are down here. It's trying to impersonate a snake. And even at the pupa stage, look what the caterpillar turns into, this thing that looks exactly like a dried leaf. So isn't it amazing that this organism has evolved all these ingenious disguises to avoid getting eaten? All right, so here's wintergreen, really common understory plant, especially under white pine trees. And you can make a sun tea from the wintergreen leaves. And the fruit is edible. It's not that sweet, but it does have the wintergreen flavor. But if I want to make a wintergreen flavored drink, I tend to make it from black or yellow birch. And this is a year-round thing. So you could do this tomorrow if you wanted to. Go out and gather some black or yellow birch twigs, and just you need to peel the twigs because the flavor, the oil of wintergreen, is in the inner bark of these twigs. And then put the peeled twigs and the peelings in a glass jar filled with water and let it sit around for an hour. And that's it. That's all you have to do to make a delicious wintergreen beverage, which tastes like drinking a wintergreen flavored lifesaver. And yes, you can tap any kind of birch for sap, just like a maple tree, using the same spiles and everything, the same bracelet bit and everything. So the sap starts flowing about 2 weeks after the maple stops. So in New Hampshire, that would be like beginning of April. And when I tapped some birch trees a number of years ago, I was getting a gallon of sap in an hour. So they really gush. Unfortunately, the sap is even waterier than maple sap, so you have to boil the heck out of it to get anything. What you eventually get looks and tastes just like molasses that you see in the bottle here. But molasses is so cheap and so easy to get at the stores. My advice would be just go buy molasses. You're not going to save any time or money tapping your own birch trees to make molasses. Having said that, if let's say you were camping during the time of the year when the birch sap is flowing and you're concerned about the potability, the water supplies, the place where you're camping, is you could tap the birch trees and get all the pure, clean drinking water you needed that way. All right. Roses are edible. All species of roses are edible, whether they're cultivated or wild. The two edible parts are rose petals and rose hips. And the rose hip is just the fruit of a rose, wild or domesticated. So where you're really going to encounter these Rosa rugosa hips is not so much in Derry, but along the ocean, quite close to the salt water, where these plants, and they're not native to there, they've naturalized from Japan there. And Rosa rugosa is probably the best plant for foraging because it has large and tasty petals and rose hips. Okay, so if you've seen a sumac plant like this and you've been worried that it was poison sumac, you've been worrying needlessly. Any sumac with tight upright clusters of red berries is not poison sumac. This is what poison sumac berries look like. They're very loose, drooping clusters of white berries. So any sumac that has these upright clusters of red berries is normally not poison sumac, it's an edible sumac. And the main thing you do is pick the ripe berry clusters and make a drink from it. So you just pick them off the plants, and then this all explained in my book is you just throw them in a bowl of water and rub them like you're kneading bread dough. And you're rubbing the flavor off the berries into the liquid, and the water will turn this pink or pinkish orange color. Fish the berries out, you're done with them. Take this liquid, pour it into through any kind of a filter like a paper towel, and then what goes through you can drink hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. So there's the sumac aid. The entire time it takes from harvesting the fruit to drinking the drink can be as little as 30 minutes. Okay, wild grapes. This is the fox grape, which it's fun to find these by your nose. In September, you're walking or riding your bike along and suddenly, grapes, grapes, where's that smell coming from? And you follow your nose to the vine, find these ripe grapes and stuff your face right by the vine. So this is the progenitor of our cultivated cultivar called the Concord grape. Here's the wild counterpart. And so these fruits will vary in flavor to flavor, but I've had some very tasty fox grapes. And so I'm gathering these every September and then making stuff with the grapes like grape sorbet or this grape cheesecake. It's really good. Then here's the other species, and it's possible you might still be able to find some of these grapes around because they ripen later. And this is the Riverside grape, and these grapes are still edible. I don't find them to be quite as tasty raw as the fox grapes, but you can still use them for jam or jelly. But some people prefer the Riverside grapes for stuffing. So these leaves are smooth and green in the underside, and the time of year to gather them is mid-June to mid-July in the dairy area. So this time of year, obviously not a good time to gather grape leaves for making stuffed grape leaves, which look like that, as you know. So these are made from those wild Riverside grape leaves.
Oh,
But you could
sorry.
still,
Just like a 10-15 minute kind of wrap up warning.
oh, all right, okay.
All right,
All
carry
right. You told me I could go till 5 of 8.
on. I realized I'm like, oh wait, we're closing at 8 o'clock again. So
Oh, you are? Okay, well, I'm going to have to, I didn't even, after this species, I'm going to skip straight to the stuff that's available now.
I'm sorry about
Okay, so
that.
that's all right. No, it's okay. I hope this proves the point. There's really a lot of edible wild plants out there, and in this talk, I'm getting to less than a quarter of all the ones that are out there. All right, so quickly, if you make pickles and you take a grape leaf and you put it in the jar where those pickles are going, those pickles will come out crisper because that grape leaf was in there. All right, so we're going to skip hazelnuts. All right, let's talk about shagbark hickories, which you should still be able to find. Look for nuts under trees that look like this, and that's what the nuts look like. Often this husk bursts off when these hit the ground, and I have found some great shagbark hickories in southern New Hampshire. Basically, if you drew a line from the area around Concord to the area around Portsmouth, and south and east of that line is shagbark hickory territory, and there are some really great trees. So look for nuts like this, and they taste like walnuts but lightly sprayed with maple syrup. So they're among my favorite wild edibles of anything there is. So there's my maple hickory nut pie. The recipe's in my book. It's a New England version of pecan pie. And were this to be a live program, I would have made one of these cookies for you, like these thumbprint cookies with barberry jelly in the center. So here's the European or common barberry. This is the one with a very tart but very tasty berries that I think makes the best jelly there is. Black walnuts are still available. You don't have to pick them off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground. They look like old green tennis balls. You have to get that husk off, which is a messy task. And then when they're like this, you have to crack them open. And that is a challenge because these shells are really hard. Here's the device I use to get them open. And then here are 2 yummy things you can make with black walnuts. And had this been a live program, I might have made these honey squares for you. Grana has an edible part that's available year-round. It's the tubers that look like this. And so far, my favorite way to use them is to slice them and fry them in a little vegetable oil and make groundnut chips. Some artichokes are available now. The plants look like this. The tubers look like this. That's what you want to dig up underneath those tall plants. And you can use them most ways to use potato. Okay, so autumn olive. This is an invasive species. It's all over southern New Hampshire. This is what it looks like in the spring. There's a close-up of the flowers. That's what the fruit looks like now. You should still be able to find these now. And there's a close-up of the fruit. You see it's got silvery white speckles on it. And I make a fruit leather from this. And first I make a puree from it. So I pick the fruit, I put it in a bowl and wash it. And then I put it into a pot and boil it up till it's soft. And then I put everything through this food mill on the right here, but you could use a sieve and a strainer and just push the pulp through and the seeds are held back. And then you end up with a frothy mauve colored puree, which I pour into trays in a food dehydrator and like that. And then I let it dry overnight. And then the next day I get a fruit leather from it that's really yummy. So there's an example of the fruit leather. And not only does it taste good, it has vitamin C in it. And the USDA did a study of the autumn olive fruit pulp, and they discovered that it's up to 18 times higher in lycopene than tomatoes. So lycopene, they're finding increasingly good evidence about how lycopene is beneficial. So that's great. And autumn olive also makes a delicious wine. All right, so here is, oh, I don't have the last slide in the show that was going to show you about a successful foraging day. So this is my last slide in the show. And hope that's fast enough for you, Liz. And here is the website I mentioned too. So this is, you go there and that's where you can see other programs I'm doing. I do have one last slideshow that's going to happen next week. And then I'm done, I believe, for the season. So if you have a friend that couldn't come tonight and doesn't want to look at a recording and wants to look at a live program, got one more chance. It's through the Tower Hill Botanic Garden. And then this book, which I keep mentioning. Yeah, so this book was published by that land trust I mentioned before, the Essex County Greenbelt Association, and because they allow foraging on all their properties that are open to the public, I'm so grateful for that. I told them just keep all the money the book makes and buy more land with it. So if you buy a book, wherever you're buying one, they get all the money. So so you can order it from Greenbelt, although it might require a trip to their office to pick it up, because I'm not sure they're mailing them. But there's also this bookstore, B Street Books, where I send them boxes of books and they will mail it directly to you if you prefer that. Okay, so with that, I'm done and I'm happy to take any questions.
Right, does anyone have any questions?
Okay, so while you're thinking of questions, I have one story queued up to tell you. All right, so keep thinking of those questions, but I have to tell you this fun story that involves New Hampshire. All right, so when I do my in-person talks, and I do them all over the place, all over New England and Eastern New York State, sometimes I do them far enough away from home, it just makes sense to camp out in the place where I'm doing the talk, stay with a friend or whatever. But a number of years ago, I had to give a talk in Wolfboro, and I didn't know anybody in that area. So I stayed in a cheap motel room that had cable TV, which I don't have at home. So I've never seen any cable TV programs. But anyway, this hotel had cable TV. So I'm surfing through the channels. And I come upon this show called Man vs. Wild, which I'd never seen before or since. And this particular episode I turned into, the guy was trying to start a fire in the Everglades, and it was in one of these swampy hummocks and everything was soaking wet. And he struggled for about 10 minutes. And I thought, this is stupid. And I shut it off. So then the next morning, I get to the meeting location where everybody for this walk is going to meet me. There's like 25 people there. Well, it turned out they had all seen the show. So they start peppering me with questions. Could you survive on this? Could you survive on that? This one guy asked me, is an acorn a complete protein? And I said to him, what kind of a strange question is that? Who would tell you that you could only eat acorns? I since found out an acorn is a complete protein, but I didn't know at the time. So, so eventually I got a little annoyed with all these questions and said, all right, you people, granted, we are in Wolfboro. It's a little boony up here, but even up here, you'd be able to hike out to the nearest 7-Eleven way before you'd find yourself in a starvation situation. All right, so relax, everybody relax. All right, then we begin the walk. And the walk is on one of these pathways, I'm sure you know, very common in New Hampshire, where they're multi-use pathways. And in the summer, they're used by the mountain bikers and the joggers. In the winter, they're used by the cross-country skiers and the snowmobilers. And the snowmobilers like to make these little hand-lettered signs, so many miles to this town, so many miles to that town. All right, so we start the walk. And 10 minutes after I make that joke, look what we saw nailed to a tree right along the path. So my point was totally proved. All right, so anyway, any questions?
There is one question. Do you forage for wild mushrooms at all?
Yes, so as you saw, we barely had time to fit in all the plants in this show. So I do happily forage for wild mushrooms, and sometimes some of my PowerPoints include talking about wild mushrooms too. And my in-person walks, if we're doing them between mid-July and mid-October, which is the main mushroom season in New England, and we encounter edible mushrooms, I absolutely teach them to people along with the edible wild plants.
Well, potentially, if the summer of 2021 things have gotten safe enough, we could maybe do a nature walk, especially.
All right.
If it's outside, that's very easy to stay distant.
Right, that's true. I did do 6 in-person walks this year with everybody with masks on and everything, and numbers were limited, but yeah, they are possible. And let me say though that this year was not, as you might guess, not a particularly good mushroom year because of the dearth of rainfall. It's basically a simple principle: no rain, no mushrooms. I mean, the species that did tend to show up were the ones that get their moisture from trees, like rotting logs or stumps or live trees. But most of the other mushrooms are very scarce this year.
Another question, how do you differentiate between curly dock and burdock?
Oh, the only similarity between those two species is the name. They're actually not related at all. So curly dock is a cousin of spinach and rhubarb, and burdock is a cousin of artichokes and and the Jerusalem artichokes I showed before. So they're that different. So anyway, curly dock has a very thin leaf with undulating leaf margins. So let's just go back to that slide. So let me just see if I can get out to here. All right, hold on a second. All right, so curly dock. Okay. And all right, so there's the curly dock, and you can, these are skinny, skinny leaves, and see how the margin of the leaf undulates like that. So burdock leaves, and let me just stay in here, and I'll just see if I can quickly go up to burdock. Okay, so burdock leaves are big and fat, so they're like 8 or 9 inches across, sometimes more, and their undersides are finely woolly, and so this, the thing that is a lookalike is actually rhubarb would be the lookalike to a burdock leaf, but rhubarb leaves are smooth on the underside, and the petioles on the burdock, so these are called petioles. You see how they have ridges on them like a celery stalk, and they're green or green streaked with a little purple. Rhubarb petioles are smooth and reddish, so they're easy to tell apart.
Oh, person just followed up. Maybe it's yellow dock that I'm confusing for curly dock.
Okay, so curly dock and yellow dock are 2 names for the exact same species.
Oh, okay.
Yellow dock is the name the herbalists refer to the plant, because they're usually focusing on the root, which is the main medicinal part of the plant.
All right, do we have any other questions?
So while you're thinking, I'm gonna just see if I can get out here and go to this slide.
Oh.
Okay, so.
Dock bake looks really good.
All right, so. Okay, so once again, there's my email address. So if you think of something afterwards, feel free to email me.
Oh,
and yeah, and then here's my schedule. And when you click on that, you're gonna see, you know, lots of cancellations and postponements. It was kind of ugly this year. You know, it was in a normal year, I'm doing like 3 dozen in-person programs, and this year it was less than a dozen because of you know why. Anyway, who knows next year? You know, next year I suspect might still be affected to some degree, but
yeah.
Let's hopefully by 2022 we're more or less back to where we were before.
Well, fingers crossed that we can at least maybe schedule some kind of a program again next year.
All right, sounds good.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening. And again, take a look at our November and December programs. All right,
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good one.
Bye.
All right. And Russ, we did send the check request out. Let me know in a week or so if you haven't gotten it in the mail, okay? Because we're mailing everything out now. Usually the way it works, it would be handing it to you at the presentation.
Okay, so I see a question somebody asked, are all the recipes in your book that you showed us? And not every single one. Like the recipe for the cattail pollen muffins isn't in the book, but a lot of the other recipes are in the book or on my webpage.
Okay. Well, thank you. Good catch on that. Yeah, sorry we had to cut a little bit short.
Yeah, it's all right. I actually, you know,
I
other than hazelnuts, I covered pretty much everything.
I was still in my head that we closed at 8:30, and I'm like, oh wait, no, we closed at 8 o'clock now. So it's, you know, still adjusting to the new COVID world.
All right. Well, thanks for the invitation to do this
You're
talk.
welcome,
It was,
and hopefully we'll be in touch regarding a future program.
all right. Sounds good.
Have a
All right. Good
night.
evening.